Have you ever wondered why the oldest traces of us feel less like beginnings and more like fragments torn from a larger story? It's as if something once known slipped into silence, leaving behind only the faintest impressions. Handprints on cave walls, symbols that look like memories rather than inventions, and a strange sense that humanity woke up halfway through its own tale. And so, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you? There is a strangeness that lingers at the threshold of our past, a quiet contradiction that scholars mention only carefully, as if acknowledging it too directly might unravel the neat chronology we've arranged for ourselves. Humanity, according to our timelines, is a species that learned slowly, stumbled often, and climbed toward complexity step by gradual step. Yet the evidence scattered across the earliest layers of our existence tells something different, something abrupt, something almost too coordinated to be accidental. It is the kind of inconsistency that resembles a missing chapter in a book, a piece deliberately torn out, leaving the story intact, but somehow incomplete. In the caves of Chauvet, Lascaux, and Sulawesi, the paintings do not look like first attempts. They look like echoes. The lines are sure, the shading deliberate, the expressions strangely modern. It is unsettling to imagine that the earliest artists were already masters of techniques that should have taken millennia to refine. Researchers have noted that the sophistication appears fully formed, like a memory resurfacing rather than a skill slowly acquired. And if that is true, if the first art was not a beginning but a survivor of something older, then what else might we have inherited without understanding the source? There is also the puzzle of our genetic simplicity, the bottleneck that left our species remarkably uniform compared to others. It is one of the great biological enigmas. How populations so reduced, so fragile, could explode into creativity and innovation in what feels like an instant. Some have suggested a near-extinction event, a brush with oblivion that forced humanity to rebuild from almost nothing. Others wonder if the genetic emptiness hides a deeper loss, a collapse of entire branches of our own story, erased by catastrophe or time. The silence is unnerving. Evolution rarely moves in leaps. But our minds, our capacity for language, abstraction, and symbolism, appear in the archaeological record as if someone flipped a switch. It leaves one wondering whether we remembered something rather than invented it. Even the simplest marks carved into bone or stone feel strangely intentional. The tally marks at Lab Bombo in Ashango, older than many civilizations, suggest an awareness of number, maybe cycles, maybe time, that should not have belonged to people living in a world without cities, agriculture, or writing. Some scholars propose they were lunar calendars. Others think they were ritual objects. Yet, whatever their purpose, they carry a feeling of continuity, as if their makers were participating in a tradition far older than their own lifetimes. A whisper of knowledge passed through generations, too faint to categorize, but too persistent to ignore. And then there is the uncanny parallelism of myths. Cultures separated by oceans, mountains, and ages speak of a world before ours, a dawn disrupted by fire or water, and a moment when something or someone intervened. These stories, often dismissed as symbolic, seem to remember an absence more than an event, a boundary across which memory dissolves. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Hawaiian chants of Nu, in the Mesoamerican tales of previous suns, humanity is always beginning again, always waking from a forgetting. It is strange how easily these stories rhyme. Perhaps the unease stems from how quickly complexity emerged after our supposed awakening. Just a few thousand years after the last ice age ended, agriculture appears, cities rise, monuments align with the stars, and mythologies intertwine with cosmology. There is no long apprenticeship in the archaeological record, no slow accumulation of trial and error. Instead, there is a sudden chorus of planning, measuring, and orienting, as if guided by an older blueprint. Gopse, older than any known city, stands as the most unsettling example. Its builders carved pillars weighing up to 20 tons, adorned them with symbology that suggests an already formed worldview, but they left no traces of the long developmental phases one would expect. It is as though the idea of building such a sanctuary arrived fully grown. Yet what troubles researchers even more is the deliberate burial of this site. To cover an entire complex with tons of earth requires intention, organization, and motive. Some believe it was abandoned ritualistically. Others think it was protected from something. But the possibility that the people who built it knew something was ending, something they hoped to preserve beneath soil and time, leads one to wonder what story those stones were meant to silence or carry forward. Even in places less monumental, the mystery persists. Shell middens, hearth sites, and scattered tools show abrupt changes in behavior, as if groups shifted from one mode of life to another, not gradually, but decisively. The evidence for these shifts is faint, but not faint enough to ignore. A sudden refinement in tool, an unexpected symbolic object buried with care, a pattern of movement suggesting a journey with purpose instead of mere wandering. It is almost as though people were following instructions they could no longer fully remember. And beneath these questions lies an even older impression, the sense that human consciousness itself carries a static charge of recollection, like a dream repeated through thousands of generations. Anthropologists note that symbolic behavior appears everywhere at once, crafting beads, burying the dead, mixing pigments, not as tentative beginnings, but as confident expressions of meaning. It feels less like discovery and more like return. One wonders whether the first storytellers were not inventing narratives, but trying to translate a memory into sound. Yet among all these uncertainties, one detail has always lingered, subtle but persistent. In various early sites, archaeologists sometimes encounter an object or motif that seems slightly out of place. Not futuristic, not impossible, simply misaligned with the surrounding context. A shape carved too precisely, a shard of pigment too pure, a symbol that matches another symbol thousands of miles away. Most are explained away, woven into the broader fabric of known cultures. But sometimes, rarely, one resists categorization, as though it belongs to a chapter missing from our collective book. Tonight, that is where the mind pauses, on the thought that perhaps our ancestors did leave us a clue. Not a message, not a warning, but a trace of continuity that survived whatever broke the world before us. A mark left intentionally or accidentally, preserved by nothing more than persistence and chance. And if such a clue exists, then the question is not what it means, but why it remained when so much else was lost. As the darkness deepens, the idea settles quietly that our origins may not be a clean line tracing back through time, but a tapestry woven from remnants of something far older, something that flickers beneath the surface of our oldest art, our oldest stories, our oldest instincts, which leads to a simple, unsettling wondering. If these fragments are merely the edges of a forgotten page, what might be waiting beyond it? It is curious how often the earliest chapters of human civilization seem to rise together, as if distant peoples who had never seen one another somehow turn their faces toward the same horizon at nearly the same moment. After lingering on the strange fracture in memory, the mind drifts naturally to the next inconsistency. The way dawn breaks across the archaeological record, not gradually, not region by region, but almost synchronously. It is too easy to call it coincidence, yet too tidy to accept without hesitation. The impression left behind is of something coordinated, though no one knows by whom or by what chain of events. Long after the Ice Age retreated, and the last great glacial walls dissolved into rivers and seas, something stirred in the human story. Within a relatively narrow span of centuries, far shorter than the slow pace expected from scattered foragers, agriculture appeared in the Near East, monumental structures rose in Anolia, and the first signs of celestial observation emerged across sites that should have had no communication between them. Even conservative scholars admit there is a puzzle here, though they often explain it with models of convergent evolution, population density, or environmental pressure. But the coincidence feels heavier than that, like a pattern pressing through the soil from underneath. Gopse returns to the mind once more, not as an isolated marvel, but as part of a larger strangeness. While its circular enclosures still captivate the world, fewer people notice how similar thought patterns appeared elsewhere. Around the same time in the British Isles, far to the west, the first hints of megalithic tradition began to take shape. Wooden circles, earthworks, alignments that seem tentative but strangely deliberate. In East Asia, early rice cultivation emerged with an orderliness that suggests prior knowledge. In the Americas, groups began shaping land and observing the sky long before the monumental civilizations we typically associate with those continents. It is as if the world exhaled and scattered groups suddenly remembered something forgotten. Scholars speak cautiously about these parallels, aware of how easily they can spark exaggerated claims. Yet the simultaneity remains, a quiet question that refuses to sink entirely into academic footnotes. Why did the shift from wandering to settling, from observing to calculating, from surviving to creating, seem to ripple outward like a wave? The evidence is too subtle to declare a single cause, yet too coherent to ignore. Farming did not emerge as a gentle meandering experiment, but as a decisive turn. Ceremonial architecture did not begin with crude trial and error forms, but with sophisticated layouts, astronomical orientations, and ritual intent. And the stars were charted with a precision that feels disproportionate to the simplicity of the tools attributed to those first sky watchers. In the highlands of Peru, the earliest agricultural terraces show an awareness of microclimates and water flow that seems far more advanced than their technological context implies. In Mesopotamia, the first urban planners arranged temples, storage areas, and communal spaces with a geometry that suggests inherited principles, not spontaneous innovation. And in Egypt, long before the pyramids, ancient communities aligned their modest structures with cardinal directions, as if instinctively oriented toward a cosmic blueprint. Perhaps it is merely the human tendency to find patterns where there are none, to wish for a shared origin story when the truth may be more fragmented. But even if one steps back from speculation, the archaeological record still carries a faint sense of orchestration, a series of sparks igniting in different landscapes, yet burning with similar light. The question, then, is whether these parallels reflect similar conditions or a similar memory. If humanity survived a collapse, genetic, climatic, or cultural, then it is possible that the seeds of civilization were not invented anew, but rediscovered, drawn from an older well whose depth we can no longer see. Some researchers have proposed that certain knowledge can persist in non-material forms, patterns of behavior, an intuitive understanding of celestial cycles, a lingering sense of ritual meaning. What if early people were not learning, but remembering? There is also the issue of migration routes. Genetic studies show that humans moved in waves, some far older than our traditional maps suggest. Ancient DNA from places like Siberia, Australia, and the Near East reveals interactions and dispersals far more complex than once imagined. If groups carrying shared knowledge spread out before or after a forgotten event, perhaps they seeded the world with the same dormant ideas that only reawakened when conditions finally permitted. Even the earliest agricultural villages, though modest, contain hints of coordination. The placement of hearths, storage pits, and communal buildings follows patterns that recur across continents. Whether these similarities arise from practicality or memory is unknown. Yet the effect is the same. The world feels like it was preparing for something. What truly deepens the mystery is the astronomical element. Across multiple early sites, Nabta Playa in the Sahara, Warrenfield in Scotland, even ancient structures in Java, there appear alignments to solstices, lunar cycles, or star paths. These are not monumental structures like Stonehenge or the Great Pyramid, but smaller, older markers of celestial awareness. Why would humanity, newly settled and occupied with survival, look to the sky with such urgency? Researchers argue that astronomy served agricultural needs, helping early communities track seasons. But the precision often exceeds mere practicality. Some of these alignments track long-term cycles that would have required generations of observation. It is possible, of course, that ancient communities simply watched the sky closely, passing down knowledge through oral tradition. Yet the uniformity of this celestial mindfulness across huge distances remains a quiet puzzle. And so we return to the idea of a message, though not in the sensational sense, not an encoded warning or deliberate transmission, rather something subtler, a shared orientation toward the cosmos, as if ancestors across the world inherited the same instinct to measure their place under the stars. And if instinct is not the right word, then perhaps it is memory, faint, collective, and unspoken. But the thought that lingers most is that this dawn did not rise evenly. Some places brightened faster, as though certain groups carried more of that forgotten knowledge than others. Others brightened more slowly, as though waiting for the right spark. The unevenness, when examined, feels almost intentional, like embers scattered after a long-extinguished fire. Archaeologists digging in the soil today occasionally find something small, a carved stone, a post-hole alignment, a worked fragment of bone, and feel that it does not quite belong to the narrative they were taught. Not because it is impossible, but because it seems too early, too refined, too reminiscent of something yet to come. These details rarely overturn consensus. They simply sit quietly, unsettling only those who spend enough time among them. And perhaps that is the true mystery of this synchronized dawn. Not that humanity advanced, but that it advanced in a way that feels familiar, as though guided by a rhythm older than the civilizations themselves, a rhythm we can sense but not fully hear. As the mind drifts at the edge of sleep, it wonders whether this simultaneity is the first thin layer covering an even deeper history, one that flickers beneath the archaeological record like a buried pulse. And if this dawn was not the beginning, then what forgotten day came before it? The thought of a synchronized dawn lingers, but it slowly gives way to something heavier, something buried literally and figuratively beneath the places where humanity first gathered. If the rise of early culture felt coordinated, then what lies beneath those early layers feels even more unsettling. Abrupt absences, silent foundations, and remnants of settlements that disappeared so completely one might believe they were never meant to be found at all. It is here, beneath the shifting soils and drowned coastlines of the early Hoysang, that another contradiction begins to surface. Not a question of how humanity advanced, but of what might have been erased before we ever had the chance to remember it. Archaeologists speak carefully about the earlier cities, often emphasizing how remarkable it is that so many of them were abandoned without clear explanation. Çatalhöyük, with its densely packed homes and strangely uniform architecture, was once a thriving community. Yet it dissolved over generations, leaving behind layers that seem to record not a collapse, but a slow turning away. There are no dramatic signs of warfare, no overt environmental catastrophe, only a gradual fading, as though the people who lived there slowly lost interest in continuing what had once been their world. In the Indus Valley, the mystery deepens. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, among the earliest planned urban centers, show signs of sophisticated engineering, drainage systems, standardized weights, and an understanding of sanitation that would not be matched for millennia. But then, almost inexplicably, these cities were abandoned, not burned, not conquered, simply emptied. Scholars debate the reason: climatic shifts, river migrations, political fragmentation. But the archaeological silence feels heavier than those explanations allow. A civilization capable of such intricacy rarely dissolves without leaving behind clear traces of struggle. Instead, the record feels like a door quietly shutting. And in Mesopotamia, the supposed cradle of civilization, the earliest layers beneath cities like Uruk and Eridu complicate the picture further. Before the writing, before the temples, before the monumental architecture, there are hints of older settlements erased by water, silt, and time. Some lie beneath river sediments deposited suddenly, as if a regional flood or something more abrupt washed away what came before. These layers do not tell a full story, but they whisper the possibility that the rise of the first cities may have been a second beginning. Geology offers its own shadows. Around 6200 BCE, the climate shifted abruptly due to the collapse of the Laurentide ice sheet. Sea levels surged. Temperatures dropped sharply across parts of the world. Coastal settlements, if they existed, would have been swallowed whole. Entire shorelines transformed in a matter of decades. And because many early human societies likely lived close to water sources, a significant portion of our pre-agricultural world may now lie beneath the sea, beyond the reach of easy excavation. Submerged ruins in places like Dogland, the Sunda Shelf, and the Persian Gulf oasis hint at such lost landscapes. These discoveries are not speculative. They are documented geological and archaeological facts. The North Sea once contained forests, rivers, and settlements. The Persian Gulf Basin, before it filled, is believed by some scholars to have been home to large human populations drawn to its freshwater springs. And yet, because these worlds now lie beneath tens of meters of water, their stories remain largely inaccessible. It is not difficult to imagine how easily a civilization, if one existed, could slip into the geological silence. But perhaps the most haunting mysteries come from small anomalies that appear in layers far older than expected. A structure beneath the sands, a tool found too deep, a fragment of pigment too sophisticated for its context. Archaeologists rarely publicize these finds widely. Most are explained through reworking of sediments or misidentification. Yet some linger. One site in particular, beneath several meters of accumulated deposit, revealed a series of carved stones whose patterns resemble those of later cultures separated by thousands of miles. The official explanation cites coincidence or natural patterning, but to those who saw them firsthand, the resemblance was unsettling. At times when researchers dig into early layers, they find evidence of sudden abandonment. Hearths left mid-use, tools scattered as though dropped, storage pits still filled. These are snapshots that suggest interruption, not gradual decline. Something happened, perhaps environmental pressure, perhaps internal conflict, or perhaps something more diffuse, a cooling of memory, a loss of knowledge so profound that communities simply no longer knew how to sustain what they had built. This possibility echoes in the ruins of places like Jeral Amr and Abu Huraira, early settlements that show a rapid transition in building styles, subsistence strategies, and symbolic expression. Some shifts align with environmental pressures, others do not. The sudden appearance of large communal buildings, followed just as suddenly by their abandonment, leaves behind a sense of a society that rose in complexity faster than it could stabilize. The pattern grows deeper when one considers the layers swallowed by rising seas. Off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean, sonar surveys have revealed what some believe to be walls, platforms, or terraces, but interpretations remain contested. Scholars rightly demand caution. Underwater geology can mimic human forms. Yet the idea persists that parts of our earliest urban experiments might lie hidden beneath waves, distorted by centuries of sediment. If these structures were ever fully investigated, they might change our understanding not of one civilization, but of the entire sequence of civilizations. And amid all this archaeological ambiguity lies a more philosophical silence, the stubborn absence of transitional stages. We see hunter-gatherers, then we see complex settlement. But the middle spaces, the experiments, the failures, the proto-cities that should logically exist, are sparse. Either they were never there, or they are buried where we cannot reach them. Either answer is difficult to accept. one might wonder whether humanity has lived through more than one beginning. Whether the world has reset itself, slowly or abruptly, more times than our memory can hold. If records were kept before writing existed, they were likely made of wood, fiber, or speech, things the earth does not preserve. What survives is only what was carved into stone or fired into clay, and perhaps the people before us had not yet learned to carve deeply enough. Yet the mind keeps returning to a single quiet detail. Every time something disappears from the archaeological record, something else appears soon after, as if taking its place. A settlement vanishes, another rises nearby. A tradition ends abruptly, its echoes surface generations later in a different land. It is not evidence of continuity, but it feels like the shadow of one. And tonight, as the layers rise and fall in thought, a question forms with a kind of hesitant gravity. If so much of the earliest world lies hidden beneath soil and sea, then the history we study may be only the exposed portion of a much larger landscape, a landscape shaped by losses we can barely reconstruct. Perhaps the missing chapter is not an event, but a silence wide enough to contain everything we have forgotten. And if even the earth cannot fully remember what came before, what hope do we have of reclaiming it? The further one moves into these buried layers, the more an older truth begins to stir, a truth that is not written in clay tablets or carved in stone, but carried in the shared breath of civilizations separated by oceans and epochs. If the missing chapter beneath our feet suggests an erased past, then the myths that drift across cultures hint at something even stranger, that humanity once remembered a world before this one, and that memory survived not through artifacts, but through stories shaped like shadows. These tales, whispered through the millennia, do not read like inventions. They read like the last reflections of something lost. It is hard to ignore how persistently these stories echo one another. Flood narratives, tales of skyborne teachers, accounts of cycles where the world is destroyed and remade, all appear in regions that should never have influenced each other. Scholars of comparative mythology have long noted the universality of these motifs. They appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the oral histories of Aboriginal Australians, in the Popol Vuh of the Mer, in Greek traditions of cataclysm, in Japanese Shinto chronicles, and even in the fragmented myths preserved by Arctic peoples whose ancestors lived in landscapes carved by ice. It would be easy to assume these similarities emerge from shared psychological patterns or environmental experiences. Yet some details are too specific, too structural, too coincidental to dismiss. Take the idea of a lost age. Many cultures speak of multiple worlds, previous creations destroyed by fire, water, wind, or time. The Maya described earlier suns collapsing. The Hopi elders spoke of worlds ending before the current one. In India, ancient cosmology recounts cycles of destruction and renewal. None of these cultures knew each other, yet all insisted that humanity did not originate in the present era. Why such insistence? Why such anonymity on the notion that a greater story preceded the one we now inhabit? Even more intriguing are the figures who appear in these myths. The ones who brought knowledge, civilizing beings who emerged from the sea, from the sky, or from distant mountains. In Sumer, their name was the Apkallu, sage-like figures associated with the flood and the re-establishment of civilization. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl was described as a bringer of order and measurement. In Polynesia, Maui was a shapeshifter who lifted the sky and organized the world. These figures often carry similar attributes: wisdom, order, tools of measurement, knowledge of agriculture or astronomy. They teach, they guide, and then they retreat, leaving humanity to navigate the world alone. Of course, mythology is not history. Yet the persistence of these motifs across continents raises questions about what they may dimly reflect. Perhaps they are metaphors for shifts in climate or culture. Perhaps they describe migrations of skilled groups who brought agriculture or ritual practices to new lands. But there is a quiet possibility that these stories may be collective memories, filtered through the poetry of generations of real people or real events, long since lost to archaeology. What complicates this further is the overwhelming presence of a flood narrative. More than 300 cultures across the world remember a deluge that erased an earlier time. Some describe a single family or small group surviving. Others speak of a remnant carrying knowledge forward. Geological evidence shows that several abrupt flooding events marked the early Hoisang: glacial outburst floods, sea level surges, tsunamis triggered by collapsing ice sheets. It would not be surprising if these events left imprints on memory. But the similarity of details, floating vessels, preserved seeds, instructions from divine or ancestral beings, suggests something deeper. For stories to survive thousands of years, carried across migratory paths and reshaped by countless tongues, they must hold a resonance that simple environmental observation cannot fully explain. The universality becomes even more striking when one looks at the theme of celestial disruption. In myths from China to Scandinavia, from the Andes to the Levant, there are accounts of the sky changing, of stars falling, of darkness swallowing the world. Some researchers link these motifs to real cosmic events, meteor impacts, volcanic eruptions, or dramatic auroral activity following solar storms. If humanity witnessed a catastrophic moment in the distant past, a moment that reshaped both the earth and the sky, it is plausible that this memory would survive as myth rather than history. Yet among all these overlapping motifs, the most haunting is the sense of inheritance. So many myths speak of teachings that were not invented by those who used them: agricultural rituals, astronomical calendars, sacred geometry. Many of these traditions appear fully formed in the earliest layers of civilization, just as the structures beneath the soil appear fully realized. Could it be that myth preserves the last flickers of practices learned long before the present cycle began? Anthropologists studying indigenous oral histories have occasionally noted details that seem too ancient to be purely symbolic. Australian song lines, for example, include accounts of coastlines that existed more than 10,000 years ago, accounts that match modern geological reconstructions. Andean traditions describe glaciers retreating and lakes forming. Even in the northern Pacific, some tribal narratives remember volcanic eruptions that occurred in the deep past. These are not myths in the sense of invented tales. They are memories woven into story. If memory can survive that long in oral form, what else might it carry? Perhaps the figures of ancient teachers were once real people whose identities dissolved into symbolism. Perhaps the cycles of destruction and renewal describe epics long before writing. Perhaps the flood narratives reflect multiple events blended into a single archetype. None of this requires supernatural interpretation. Yet the idea that myth might carry fragments of forgotten epics is unsettling in another way. It suggests that humanity has been trying to remember something vast and fragile, a story too large to articulate but too important to lose. The mind circles back to the strange parallelism of symbols. Serpents coiled around trees or staffs, birds as messengers between worlds, mountains described as places where knowledge descends or ascends. In cultures with no contact, these motifs recur like the refrain of a forgotten song. Some scholars attribute this to shared cognitive structures. Others propose diffusion across ancient migration routes. But another thought hovers quietly. What if these images come from a time when humanity was not yet divided by oceans or continents? When a single worldview, however primitive, shaped the collective imagination. And yet the myths do not fully agree. Some describe the world ending because of human arrogance. Others blame divine quarrels, cosmic accidents, or natural cycles. But beneath these variations lies a shared longing, a sense that something precious was lost, something that connected the heavens and the earth, the past and the present. A golden age, a first world, a forgotten dawn. As sleep drifts closer, the question grows heavier. What if myths are not primitive explanations, but the last surviving threads of a tapestry woven in a world we no longer remember. A world erased not by time alone, but by the fragility of human memory. And if these myths are fragments, what original story did they once belong to? And why were we never meant to keep it whole? As the echoes of myth settle into a soft, lingering haze, another layer of the puzzle rises quietly to the surface, a layer not built of stone or earth, but of sound, structure, and the elusive architecture of human speech. If stories across distant continents recall a world before this one, then languages that stand alone, unrelated, unrooted, isolated, like drifting islands, carry an even stranger whisper. They feel like the voices of survivors, linguistic remnants from an earlier world that did not fully vanish, even when everything else did. The more one examines these languages, the more they resemble shards of a broken vessel. Sumerian, perhaps the most famous isolate, appears suddenly in the archaeological record with no known ancestor. It does not branch from anything earlier, nor does it share the structure of its later neighbors. It stands alone with grammar and vocabulary that seem unconnected to the linguistic family surrounding it. Scholars have tried for decades to trace its lineage, to find the roots from which it might have grown, but the roots dissolve into silence. Sumerian feels less like the beginning of a tradition and more like the final echo of one. Across the world, far from Mesopotamia, the Basque language occupies a similar position, utterly isolated among the Indo-European tongues that came to dominate Europe. Genetic studies of Basque population show continuity stretching back long before the Bronze Age, as if the people and their language both survived a transition that erased others. No one knows where Basque originated. It is not a cousin of anything spoken nearby. It has no known siblings. It simply persists, carrying an ancient rhythm that does not match the cadence of the world around it. In Japan, the Innu language presents another anomaly. Its structure, phonetics, and deep-time vocabulary align with no major linguistic family. The Innu people themselves hold traditions that speak of earlier worlds, earlier beings, and earlier landscapes. Some researchers suggest the Innu language may preserve remnants of Paleolithic speech patterns once widespread across northern Eurasia. But if so, why did those patterns vanish everywhere else? Why did only fragments remain? There are more. The isolates of the Caucasus with phonetic inventory, so complex they resemble living fossils of linguistic diversity. The Andes languages spoken by some of the most genetically distinct human groups. The Elamite tongue of ancient Iran, which refuses to be neatly categorized. The linguistic puzzles of the ancient Levant, where inscriptions appear that do not match known Semitic or Huron roots. Each of these languages stands alone like a lone tree on a cliff, where an entire forest once grew. Some might argue that isolates are simply the remnants of once diverse linguistic families, whose other branches disappeared through migration, assimilation, or conquest. There is truth in that, but the pattern remains unsettling. Why do these remnants cluster in places associated with ancient continuity? Mountain ranges, coastlines, isolated valleys, regions that might have sheltered people through cataclysm or collapse. And why do so many linguistic isolates correspond to regions where archaeology suggests deeper layers of habitation than the surrounding areas? Then there are the undeciphered scripts, small, stubborn, and resistant to every attempt to decode them. Linear A of Cree, the writing of the Indus Valley, the venture symbols of southeastern Europe, the Rangorongo glyphs of Easter Island. Some may not be full writing systems, but others clearly encode structured information. Linear A appears to represent a complete language, but one with no known relatives. The Indus script, stamped onto seals and pottery, preserves a lost tongue spoken by a civilization that vanished so thoroughly not even its linguistic shadow survives. And the venture signs, older than most writing systems, appear too systematically arranged to be random symbols. Their meaning is unknown. Their origins are unknown. Their connection to later cultures is unknown. Perhaps these scripts belong to languages that once tied continents together before migration, climate shifts, and cultural upheaval scattered their speakers. Or perhaps they are fragments of traditions so ancient they existed long before the linguistic families we recognize today. Proto-Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Sino-Tibetan took shape. If that is true, then the languages we know may be only the younger branches of a far older linguistic tree. Some linguists have attempted to reconstruct proto-languages older than Proto-Indo-European, Nostratic, Eurasiatic, even Proto-Human. These attempts are controversial, often dismissed as speculative, yet they reveal something striking. No matter how far back scholars attempt to reach, they eventually hit the same barrier, an event or transition so profound that linguistic lineages blur into noise. Words drift, sounds change, structures collapse. It is as though something interrupted the natural development of human language in the deep past. Something that reset the patterns, leaving only fragments to survive in isolated regions. And yet, amid this chaos, certain symbols recur across cultures with unnerving regularity. Spirals carved into stone in Ireland, Malta, and the American Southwest. I like motifs in Egypt, Anatolia, and the Pacific. Serpent forms appearing in early Asian, American, and African art. Some of these similarities can be explained by universal human cognition. Others may result from migration patterns, but there are instances where the resemblance is too precise, too structural, to be dismissed entirely. A spiral curling clockwise in one region and counterclockwise in another could mean coincidence. But when the spiral appears with the same number of turns, in similar ceremonial contexts, and associated with similar cosmological ideas, the coincidence becomes less comfortable. Some researchers argue that such symbols reflect universal astronomical observations, solar cycles, lunar phases, precession. Yet, if that were the case, why do some of these symbols appear long before the societies in question developed the tools to observe such cycles clearly? Then there is the case of a particular PHM, a sound pattern that recurs in several isolates despite their enormous geographical separation. Its presence means nothing definitive, yet it feels like a faint remainder of an earlier lexicon, a sound shaped by tongues long vanished, carried across landscapes we can no longer map. Perhaps it is coincidence. Perhaps it is the remnant of a shared past so distant that the evidence has eroded beyond recognition. In the quiet of night, the mind wonders whether linguistic isolates might be time capsules, preserving ways of speaking from a world erased by flood, fire, or forgetting. If myth remembers what the earth has buried, then language may remember what myth has forgotten. What if the oldest languages are not archaic beginnings, but survivors, the last flickers of voices that once filled a world now lost? The thought lingers, fragile and persistent. If these languages are relics of an older epoch, then the question grows unavoidable. How much of our past did silence swallow? And how much remains waiting in the words we can no longer understand? And perhaps somewhere in those undeciphered signs or isolated grammars lies a clue, a syllable, a symbol, a pattern left behind by ancestors whose world crumbled before ours had even begun. As the strangeness of language drifts into thought, another thread begins to weave itself through the quiet. The world's first cities, those early clusters of stone, clay, and intention that appeared with a confidence that feels disproportionate to their age. It is one thing for humanity to develop speech, stories, and symbols. It is another to gather in organized settlements, to shape landscapes with purpose, to carve stone as though guided by a blueprint older than the hands that held the tools. The earlier cities, when observed without preconceptions, look less like beginnings and more like resurgences, places where knowledge resurfaced suddenly, as though awakened. Consider Eridu, often called the first city. Archaeologists who excavated its earliest layers noted something peculiar. The first structures were not crude. They were simple, yes, but they showed an understanding of spatial organization and ceremonial hierarchy that suggest a pre-existing cultural framework. How does a city begin with a temple complex? How does ritual architecture emerge before the gradual evolution of civic life? One would expect trial and error, false starts, shifting patterns. Instead, Eridu appears with a clarity that hints at inherited knowledge. Uruk rising after Eridu intensified this anomaly. Here, the world's first monumental architecture took shape. The White Temple, elevated on a platform, dominated the landscape like a deliberate statement. The precision of its orientation, its geometric layout, and the complexity of its administrative system suggest an intellectual leap that should have taken many generations. Yet the archaeological layers show no lengthy developmental stages, only the sudden appearance of organized labor, intricate accounting systems, and a symbolic order that seems to descend rather than ascend. The same pattern appears in Egypt. Before the pyramids, before the divine kingship matured into its classical form, there were communities building mastabas aligned with the cardinal directions, following proportions that would later define their monumental architecture. The tools were simple, the world young, yet the precision was extraordinary. How did early Egyptians achieve alignments so exact that modern researchers still debate the methods? Some argue that trial and error refined these techniques. Others note that the earlier structures show fewer mistakes than expected, as if the builders were recalling principles rather than discovering them. Even in the Andes, where the earliest urban experiments emerged independently from the Old World, cities like Corral appear with an architectural logic that feels strangely mature. Circular plazas, platform mounds, and ritual pathways materialize in the archaeological record, not as tentative prototypes, but as confident expressions of cosmology. The people of Cairo understood acoustic engineering, astronomical sight lines, and the symbolic use of space long before they developed ceramics or extensive metallurgy. It is as though their architecture belonged to a tradition older than their material culture. These mysteries grow deeper when one looks at the early stonework traditions scattered across the globe. The precision of polygonal masonry in places like Sakyewan, the Cyclopean walls of the Mediterranean, and the megalithic structures across Europe defies simple explanation. The stones are massive, irregular in shape, yet fitted so tightly that even a blade cannot slide between them. This technique requires not only skill but foresight, planning, and a level of cooperation difficult for small, newly settled communities to achieve. And yet, no clear developmental sequence exists. We find mastery, then decline. It is as though the knowledge arrived fully formed, then slowly faded. Some scholars explain this as the natural outcome of cultural transmission, combined with early experimentation. But the absence of intermediate forms remains troubling. Most inventions, writing, metallurgy, agriculture, show gradual improvement. But early city building, early stonework, early astronomical alignment, these appear like sudden illuminations, which brings the mind to an even more delicate puzzle: the origins of measurement. Long before standardized systems appeared in Egypt or Mesopotamia, early builders used ratios and geometric principles with surprising consistency. The 3-4-5 triangle, the use of cardinal directions, and the alignment of structures to solstices and equinoxes seem to appear independently across regions that had no contact with each other. Perhaps this is coincidence, or perhaps these principles were intuitive to early observers who lived more closely attuned to the rhythms of nature. Yet the precision, especially at sites like Naphtalier, Gebesep, and early Jan ceremonial structures, suggests more than intuition. It feels deliberate, inherited, or rediscovered. The enclosures at Gobek intensify this suspicion. The pillars decorated with reliefs of animals, abstract symbols, and strangely anthropomorphic forms stand in a circular arrangement, whose meaning is still debated. But what is certain is that the builders possessed a level of organization and architectural vision that contradicts the idea of small, nomadic hunter-gatherer groups operating without a structural framework. They carved 20-ton stones. They erected them in carefully designed formations. And then, inexplicably, they buried the site. Burial is a curious act. It is not abandonment, it is preservation. To bury something so massive, so carefully, requires coordination, intention, and motive. Some researchers believe that the people of Quebec covered their sanctuary as part of a ritual cycle. Others think a shift in climate forced them to leave. But the notion that they buried it to protect the knowledge embedded within, whether consciously or instinctively, continues to haunt those who contemplate the site. If early city builders inherited knowledge, then the question becomes, inherited from whom? Not in the sense of lost civilizations, far beyond the scope of available evidence, but from ancestors whose world did not entirely survive the climatic and geological upheavals of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Perhaps the first cities were not the beginning, but the return. Even metallurgy reveals similar stranges. Copper working emerges in the archaeological record in several regions at nearly the same time. But early metal artifacts often display high purity, deliberate alloys, and consistent heating techniques. Again, where are the experimental stages? Where are the crude attempts, the gradual refinement? Instead, much of the earliest evidence shows an understanding of temperatures and material behavior that implies pre-existing knowledge. Even if that knowledge had to be rebuilt after long periods of disruption, the more one looks, the more the early world feels like the aftermath of an earlier cycle. Not advanced in the modern sense, not machines or cities of metal or impossible technologies, but advanced in understanding stone, stars, cycles, measurement, alignment, symbolism. Perhaps our ancestors did not invent the first city. Perhaps they remembered the idea of a city. Not the structures, not the techniques, but the concept. The notion that space can reflect the sky. That ritual can bind community. That architecture can embody cosmology. And if that is true, then the earliest urban planners were not innovators, but inheritors of a vision that preceded them, shaped by hands lost to time. As night deepens and the mind drifts toward quiet, one thought remains suspended. If the world's first cities appear more like returns than beginnings, then what earlier world taught humanity how to build? And how much of that world lies beneath the soil, waiting patiently for someone to recognize its faint outline in the ruins we think we understand? If the first cities whisper of an older blueprint, then the human body, its genes, its patterns, its strange inheritances, whispers of an older story still. It is in the quiet language of biology that another fracture emerges, one more intimate than buried ruins or ancient stones. When researchers mapped the human genome and compared it to the deep past, they found not a clean lineage, but a mosaic. Threads from vanished peoples, traces of unknown ancestors, and scars left by events so severe they nearly erased us. And in those scars lies a mystery as old as the species itself. Geneticists speak of something called a bottleneck, a moment when humanity nearly disappeared. Tens of thousands of years ago, our population may have shrunk to a few thousand individuals, perhaps fewer. The causes remain debated: climate instability, volcanic eruptions, disease, or something more complex. But whatever happened, the effect was profound. Diversity collapsed. Entire branches of our lineage vanished. We became, compared to other animals, eerily uniform, a species with strangely little variation, as though the world had pressed a reset button. What makes this even more unsettling is how quickly humanity flourished afterward. From near extinction to global expansion, from fragile bands of wanderers to creators of art, myth, and ceremony, something shifted. Something accelerated. Some scientists point to genetic mutations, FOXP2 for language, microfilling variants associated with brain development, or changes affecting memory and social cognition. But these mutations appear abruptly, clustered in time as if shaped not by slow, random drift, but by sudden pressures or opportunities we no longer understand. This is not to say humanity was transformed overnight, but the changes do not follow the smooth curve one expects. Instead, they resemble jumps, quiet leaps that leave faint footprints across the archaeological record. One of those footprints lies in the Denisovans, a mysterious hominin group known only from fragments of bone and teeth. Their genetic legacy survives in the peoples of Oceania, Southeast Asia, and parts of the Tibetan Plateau. The Denisovans themselves are gone, but their DNA lives on like the echo of a voice from a world erased. Their contribution is not trivial. High-altitude adaptation in Tibetans, allowing survival in thin air, comes from Denisovan genes. Other traits still being studied hint at immune system advantages or metabolic differences. This implies that humanity did not walk alone into the Hoysang. We carried ghosts with us. We are, in a sense, hybrids woven from lineages that no longer exist. Even stranger is the existence of ghost populations, ancestral groups inferred entirely from genetic patterns despite leaving no known fossils. Their DNA strands wind through ours like threads from an invisible loom. Some researchers propose that these unknown hominins interbred with early humans somewhere in Africa. Others believe there were multiple such groups now lost to time. Their absence is not the problem. Their traces are, for they imply encounters, interactions, stories that predate everything we think we know. One wonders what these forgotten groups looked like, how they lived, what knowledge they carried, and why their entire existence has been reduced to faint genetic echoes buried within our cells. But even among Homo sapiens itself, the patterns feel uneven. Cognitive complexity, symbolic thought, planning, and creativity seem to bloom suddenly. Archaeological sites reveal earlier humans made tools for hundreds of thousands of years with little change, then abruptly began carving figurines, mixing pigments, crafting ornaments, burying their dead with ritual intention. The transition is not gradual, it is a cliff. Some attribute this shift to population density or environmental stress. Others suggest it reflects the emergence of language or the neurological reorganization that underlies abstract thought. But again, the timing is oddly synchronized across regions that should not have been in contact. In Europe, Africa, the Levant, and Asia, symbolic behavior emerges within a narrow window, too narrow for slow diffusion, too broad for coincidence. There is a theory, not accepted universally but discussed quietly, that human consciousness may have passed through periods of contraction and expansion. In this view, symbolic thought is not a simple invention but a kind of awakening, a phase shift. Something allowed the human mind to see the world differently, to perceive patterns, to imagine stories, to mark meaning onto objects and landscapes. Whether this shift was biological, environmental, or cultural remains unknown, but its abruptness remains a puzzle. And then there is the matter of memory, deep evolutionary memory, the kind encoded not in conscious thought, but in behavior and instinct. The tendency to build circles, to mark cardinal directions, to bury the dead, to gather in communal spaces, to carve spirals. All these behaviors appear independently across continents. They feel older than culture, older than cities, older than myth. Could such instincts be remnants of traditions belonging to earlier humans, or even to those ghost populations whose genes linger in us? Perhaps humanity, in its near extinction, lost more than genetic diversity. Perhaps it lost knowledge, ways of speaking, ways of organizing life, ways of seeing the cosmos that later generations only partially rediscovered. The sudden flowering of culture might then be the slow return of something once known, now filtered through new minds. One cannot help noticing another strange pattern. The oldest symbolic artifacts often appear in places associated with survival during climatic extremes. Mountain refuse, coastal caves, inland valleys sheltered from glaciation. These places may have protected not only people but also memory. If the world outside collapsed, if populations dwindled, if ancient networks fractured, Then these refugees may have held the last embers of knowledge that re-emerged when the climate stabilized. But perhaps the most haunting puzzle of all lies in a single genetic clue, a variant that appears unexpectedly old, predating some migrations, yet surviving in populations that should not share ancestry at that depth. Its presence suggests contact between groups whose interaction cannot be easily mapped. Some researchers explain it through complex migration patterns. Others admit the possibility of an unknown interaction, an exchange, a meeting, emerging somewhere in the prehistoric landscape. The thought itself is simple. Humans are older than our history, and our history is older than our memory. So what then are we? If our genes come from multiple lineages, if our minds evolved through abrupt shifts, if our cultures retain echoes of forgotten worlds, then humanity may be less a single story and more a tapestry woven from disappearances. We are the survivors of survivors, the inheritors of inheritances whose shapes we can barely trace. Yet something in our biology suggests continuity, an unbroken thread stretching from deep time to the present. A fragment of DNA, a buried instinct, a symbolic gesture repeated across continents. These remnants feel like dim lights in a long corridor. They do not tell the whole story, but they hint at a structure behind the shadows. And as the night deepens, the mind wonders quietly whether the human story is not straightforward evolution, but something stranger, a sequence of rises and falls, expansions and contractions, encounters and vanishings, an ancient rhythm pulsing beneath the surface of time. If so much of who we are comes from forgotten lineages and lost worlds, then what else might be hiding in the spaces between our genes, waiting perhaps for the right moment to be understood? And if the body remembers what the mind has forgotten, then what truth is it trying to whisper through the silence of our origins? The further one follows the threads woven through our bodies, the more they begin to converge on something deeper, something not held in language or myth, nor shaped by cities or stone, but carved into the earth itself. If genetics reveals the shadows of forgotten peoples, and early civilizations reveal echoes of forgotten knowledge, then geology reveals something more abrupt, scars left by forces so immense that human memory alone could never contain them. And yet, strangely, many of the world's ancient traditions seem to strain toward recalling precisely those forces, as if some fragment of ancestral awareness survived the collapse of worlds. The landscape of the past is not the landscape we know. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters as the Ice Age ended. Entire continents' worth of coastal plains drowned beneath advancing waters. Ancient rivers shifted. Inland seas dried. Mountains shed glaciers, sending torrents across valleys. The world that humanity inherited was not the world humanity first walked through. And it is in the silence between those two worlds, a silence measured in submerged plains and missing shorelines, that the next layer of the mystery resides. The Younger Dus, a period of abrupt cooling that began roughly 12,900 years ago, has long unsettled researchers. The change was sudden, so sudden that in some regions, temperatures dropped by double digits within decades. Some theories propose that meltwater from retreating ice destabilized ocean currents. Others suggest a more violent cause, the impact of fragments from a disintegrating comet or a series of atmospheric explosions similar to the Tunguska event. These hypotheses remain debated. Yet the geological markers, layers of platinum anomalies, nanodiamonds, burned fields, suggest that something unusual occurred. Whether or not it explains the global cooling, the evidence hints at a climatic shock that could have reshaped ecosystems, displaced populations, and erased memories. What is stranger is how sharply the Younger Dryas ended. After more than 1,000 years of cold, the climate swung back to warmth within the span of a human lifetime. For people living through that time, it must have felt like the sky itself had changed its mind. Glaciers retreated, forests advanced, coastlines shifted, And with these changes, entire landscapes that had sheltered humanity became uninhabitable or disappeared beneath rising water. If civilizations existed before this period, complex or simple, fragile or flourishing, much of their material world may now lie on continental shelves far from the reach of archaeologists. Dogger Land, the land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, is one of these submerged worlds. Sonar scans reveal former rivers, lakes, and structures that appear, as some cautiously interpret, as remnants of human activity. Whether huts, platforms, or natural formations, the shapes evoke a history drowned rather than erased. The Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia tells a similar story. A vast region that was once a continuous land mass now lies beneath the sea, its former inhabitants leaving only the faintest archaeological traces along today's coasts. The Persian Gulf Basin, too, was once a fertile plain with freshwater springs, an environment that could have supported thriving human groups long before Mesopotamia formed its earlier cities. Yet all these landscapes are hidden now, sealed beneath water and sediment. Some ancient myths describe lost lands not in romantic terms, but with an eerie specificity. Floods that swallowed valleys, shores that crumbled, mountains that broke. While such tales are often interpreted symbolically, the geological record gives them a different weight. Perhaps stories of a deluge did not emerge from imagination alone, but from genuine collective trauma, retold until the details blurred into metaphor. The memory of a world ending might persist long after the reasons have been forgotten. Even inland, the earth carries traces of abrupt change. Lake Agassiz, a vast glacial lake in North America, drained catastrophically at least once, sending torrents across the continent and into the North Atlantic. The Msula floods in the Pacific Northwest carved canyons in days. The eruption of Mount Tabor tens of thousands of years earlier coated regions in ash so thick it altered global climate. Each event in its own time may have reshaped human populations, forcing migrations, bottlenecks, and the loss of cultural continuity. But geology also reveals subtler patterns. Ancient shorelines found at unexpected elevations, strata containing sudden deposits of charcoal, layers of soil showing decades of drought followed by sudden floods. These are not signs of global cataclysm, but of repeated regional shocks, shocks that would have shaped human dispersal, memory, and survival strategies. And each time the world shifted, it reshaped the landscapes where early humans carved meaning into stone. If symbolic traditions emerged, faded, and resurfaced, perhaps they reflect the cycles of stability and upheaval that define prehistory. One cannot ignore the caves, where some of the world's oldest art was found. Many lie near former coastal regions now submerged. Others are situated on steep cliffs formed by rapid geological uplift or erosion. The people who created those images may have experienced a world in transition, a world where the horizon changed within their lifetime. If memory itself is shaped by landscape, then the disappearance of that landscape may have fractured memory in ways we cannot fully grasp. There is also an unsettling pattern in early archaeological sites. Many show signs of repeated occupation separated by gaps. A valley inhabited for thousands of years suddenly falls silent, only to be reoccupied centuries later by a culture with different tools, different symbols, different ways of seeing the world. Scholars attribute these gaps to climate, resource depletion, or migration. But the silence itself, those layers of uninhabited soil, suggest something else. A loss, a forgetting, a world paused between breaths. And then there are the structures whose ages remain debated. Submerged formations off Yononi in Japan, terrace shapes off the coast of India, massive stones beneath the water near Malta. Most researchers caution that these may be natural formations, and they may be right. Yet the mere possibility that early humans shaped landscapes now underwater forces one to reconsider how much prehistory the ocean conceals. Even inland megalithic sites raise questions. Why do some structures appear more primitive than later ones? Yet others show mastery that seems disproportionate to their supposed age. Why do some cultures begin with monumental architecture before developing basic pottery or metal working? The stratigraphic layers often answer these questions ambiguously, as though the Earth itself hesitates to reveal a coherent timeline. Perhaps the deepest mystery is not that the past was erased, but that it was erased unevenly. Some knowledge survived in pockets, highlands, plateaus, regions far from glacial edges or flood zones. Other knowledge vanished without trace. What remains to us is a patchwork, fragments of worlds that endured and fragments of worlds that drowned. And somewhere in that silence lies the question that refuses to fade. How many times did humanity begin again? How many worlds came before this one, leaving only faint geological murmurs to remind us they ever existed? As the mind drifts deeper into the submerged landscapes of the past, a new thought begins to surface, quietly at first, then with growing insistence. If the world has turned over itself more than once, if the skies and seas have erased chapters we can no longer read, then what did our ancestors leave behind to outlast the rising waters and shifting continents? Not stories for stories fade, not tools for tools decay. What remains stubborn and enduring long after memory dissolves is stone. And in stone, humanity carved something. Signs, alignments, orientations that seem less like decorations and more like attempts to transmit knowledge across an abyss of time. It begins with the alignments across deserts and mountains, across islands and plains, across continents that had no contact for thousands of years. Early structures point not toward earthly markers, but toward the sky. Standing stones tilt toward solstices. Temples orient themselves to equinoxes. Megalithic complexes mirror constellations. For a species whose survival depended on food, shelter, and safety, such precision seems disproportionate, unless the heavens once meant more than stories. Perhaps they were a map, a clock, a warning, or perhaps the stars offered continuity in a world where the earth itself kept shifting. Nabta Playa, a stone circle older than Stonehenge, lies in what is now the Sahara Desert. Its alignments track the summer solstice, pointing toward the rising of Orion's belt, an asterism that appears again and again in cultures across the world. Scholars debate the meaning of these orientations, but the precision is not in dispute. The people who placed these stones lived long before the Nile Valley became a cradle of civilization. They lived before writing, before cities, before agriculture took root in their region. Yet they watched the sky with a mathematical discipline that suggests something more than idle curiosity. Further north, across the Mediterranean, early European megaliths echo this pattern. At New Grange in Ireland, the midwinter sun enters a narrow opening only on a specific day of the year, illuminating a chamber that has remained dry and aligned for more than 5,000 years. The design is so deliberate, so exact, that even slight shifts in stone placement would have broken the effect. How did people living in a landscape of forests and storms achieve such precision? The question grows stranger when one recalls that these structures were among the first monumental works ever built in that region. They did not represent the culmination of centuries of architectural improvement. They were the beginning, and yet in some ways the most sophisticated. The pattern persists in Anatolia, in the Levant, in the Americas. At Chenquillo in Peru, 13 towers mark the annual movement of the sun, with such accuracy that modern researchers call it the oldest known solar observatory in the Western Hemisphere. In the American Southwest, petroglyphs and stone markers track solstitial sunlight with elegant simplicity. In Polynesia, temples known as marae were aligned with star paths used for navigation across thousands of miles of open ocean. Everywhere stone speaks the same language, the sky mattered. But these alignments are only one part of the puzzle. The stones also encode patterns, ratios, proportions, geometric relationships that appear across cultures separated by oceans. The triangle with sides in a 3, 4, 5 ratio used for right angles emerges independently in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the Mediterranean, in ancient India, and in the early Americas. The division of circles into 360 degrees appears in more than one early culture. Spirals, concentric circles, and interlocking geometric motifs recur with such frequency that some researchers argue they represent universal aesthetic preferences. Yet their consistent use in astronomical, ritual, and ceremonial contexts suggests a deeper meaning. One cannot escape the impression that early humanity attempted to encode something fundamental, something meant to survive the collapse of worlds. Unlike stories carried in memory, stones endure. Unlike languages that evolve beyond recognition, geometry remains constant. A circle is a circle, whether carved 5,000 years ago or today. A solstice is a solstice, no matter how the climate shifts. If one wished to transmit knowledge across ages, across floods, across resets, stone and stars would be the medium. But what knowledge? That is the question researchers have never fully answered. Some propose agricultural calendars, others suggest rituals tied to myth. But deeper beneath those explanations lies an intuition. These alignments, these ratios, these repeating symbols feel like fragments of a worldview older than any civilization we know. Perhaps they reflect a time when the sky was the one stable truth in a world, repeatedly reshaped by ice and fire. Or perhaps they encode something else, cycles not merely seasonal but cosmological. The precession of the equinox, a slow wobble of the Earth's axis over a 26,000-year cycle, appears referenced in myths from India, Egypt, Greece, and Mesoamerica. Whether these cultures understood precession directly is debated, but the symbolic references, the ages, the changing skies, the stories of shifting stars, suggest that someone somewhere noticed a pattern beyond human lifespan. Observing precession requires generations of meticulous sky watching. Such a task is difficult for settled populations, nearly impossible for nomadic ones. Yet the consistency of these references across cultures raises questions about who noticed and when. In some sites, stone markers appear aligned not with contemporary star positions, but with star positions thousands of years earlier. It is as though the builders aimed not to describe the sky above their own heads, but to evoke a memory of an older sky, a sky their ancestors once used as a reference. If so, then the stones are not simply astronomical tools. They are monuments to continuity, attempts to reach back toward a time before the floods, before the ice melted, before the earth remade itself. There is another detail easily overlooked. Many megalithic sites include stones that appear deliberately unfinished or deliberately misplaced. Some researchers argue these were abandoned during construction. Others think they were part of symbolic narratives. But another possibility lingers, that the builders attempted to preserve not only the knowledge encoded in the final structures, but also the process of building itself. Tools can be lost, texts can burn, but the alignment of stones, if done with intention, can last through ages. And yet, despite all this effort, much of the meaning remains just beyond reach. We see the alignments, the geometry, the repeated motifs. We recognize the sophistication, but the worldview behind these choices is missing. Perhaps it vanished when the coastlines drowned. Perhaps it lingered only in oral traditions that fractured over millennia. Or perhaps it was never meant to be understood in isolation, each site but one note in a larger composition, now mostly erased. Still, a quiet suspicion persists that our ancestors were not merely watching the sky but listening to it, that they sensed cycles repeating across epochs, and that the stones were placed not to worship those cycles but to remember them. And if that is true, then the question becomes unavoidable. What pattern were they trying so hard to preserve? And why did they believe the future would need it? If the stones were attempts to preserve something vital, then what happened afterward? The long centuries in which so much was lost reveals a different kind of mystery. Not the mystery of forgotten epics or submerged landscapes, but the mystery of erasure, carried out not by ice or oceans, but by human hands. Beneath the alignments and monuments, beneath the geometry drawn into bedrock, lies a quieter story. A story of what we chose not to remember, what we destroyed, and what we allowed to slip from view. It is a story that weaves through empires, religions, wars, reforms, and intellectual revolutions. And it suggests that human history may not simply be shaped by what survived, but by what someone at some time decided should not. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is the most famous symbol of this erasure. Though historians debate which fire, Julius Caesar's siege, the decree of Theophilus, or the later actions under Islamic rule, caused the greatest damage, all agree on the outcome. An unfathomable volume of ancient knowledge vanished. Accounts describe tens of thousands of scrolls, perhaps more, containing mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, philosophical writings, and records of civilizations older than Egypt itself. Some scholars claim these numbers are exaggerated. Others believe the loss was incalculable. What remains undeniable is that a central node of knowledge collapsed, leaving the world with only fragments of its former intellectual inheritance. Yet Alexandria was not a singular tragedy. Across the ancient world, texts were burned, temples razed, oral traditions suppressed, and entire intellectual lineages extinguished. When the Qin dynasty unified China, the emperor ordered books burned and scholars buried alive to standardize thought. When the Spanish reached the Americas, thousands of mayadis were systematically destroyed, leaving only a handful of surviving texts to hint at a vast intellectual universe now lost. In Mesopotamia, entire libraries of clay tablets crumbled under conquest and neglect. Some were preserved inadvertently by fire, others dissolved back into dust. Perhaps most unsettling is how often these acts of erasure accompanied shifts in power. When a new order rose, political, religious, or ideological, it often rewrote the past to justify itself. The victors inherited not only lands but narratives. Chronicles were revised, genealogies altered, myths reshaped. Even timelines were adjusted to align with cosmologies, doctrines, or imperial ambitions. And because so much of ancient history survived through scribes, monks, and court historians, the possibility that earlier realities were suppressed or reshaped becomes difficult to dismiss. The emergence of monotheistic religions intensified this tension. In many cases, older cosmologies were declared heretical. Temples were dismantled, statues defaced, symbols buried or repurposed. The early church adopted some aspects of pagan tradition while denouncing others. The Islamic world preserved an extraordinary amount of Greek knowledge while rejecting or editing elements that did not align with its theological framework. Judaism carried ancient narratives forward, but often reframed them within new covenants and new historical arcs. And in all these processes, fragments of earlier worlds remained, but the coherence dissolved. One cannot help wondering what information once existed about the earlier cycles of humanity, knowledge that might have offered clues to the stone alignments or the forgotten landscapes now underwater. Were there scrolls describing astronomical cycles older than recorded history? Treatises on ancient migration swallowed by rising seas? Records of civilizations erased by climate or conflict? Perhaps even reflection on how many times the world had remade itself? We do not know. We cannot know. The archive is broken. Even when knowledge was not deliberately erased, it was often filtered. Scribes copied what they deemed important. Monastic communities preserved texts aligned with doctrine. Rulers commissioned histories that celebrated their lineage. Traditions that contradicted accepted narratives withered. Oral cultures fared no better. When a community was displaced, conquered, or assimilated, its stories were often lost within a generation. The silence that followed these disappearances was rarely accidental. Yet not all suppression was overt. Some erasure came from the slow pressure of intellectual frameworks that simply declared certain ideas impossible. As academic disciplines formed, archaeology, anthropology, geology, they developed boundaries, assumptions, and methodologies. These were essential for rigor, but they also shaped what questions could be asked. Artifacts that did not fit expected timelines were dismissed as misidentified or intrusive. Myths hinting at older worlds were categorized as symbolic. Oral histories with extraordinary antiquity were treated as metaphor. Scholars who challenged these assumptions often found their careers sidelined. This is not a conspiracy, but a pattern, a system that preserves coherence by discarding anomalies. And yet the anomalies persist. In excavation reports, one sometimes finds notes, brief, cautious, about artifacts recovered from layers deeper than expected, or symbols carved in styles inconsistent with their context, or structures whose alignment suggests knowledge exceeding the technical capabilities attributed to the builders. These are rarely discussed publicly, not because they are suppressed, but because they are inconvenient. They raise questions that cannot be answered without unraveling established chronologies. Perhaps the clearest example of subtle erasure lies in the transmission of mathematical knowledge. Some early civilizations used complex geometry and astronomical cycles long before their writing systems recorded theoretical texts. The knowledge appears practical, not abstract. Some researchers propose that these techniques were developed through generations of observation. Others suspect they were inherited from older tradition that left no written trace. The truth lies buried beneath layers of cultural sediment, obscured by time and by the framework scholars used to interpret it. Religion, empire, academia, they each preserved fragments and lost others, not intentionally, not maliciously, but inevitably. Humanity remembers selectively, which leads to a deeper question. How much of what we call history is simply what survived chance and power? If early civilizations encoded knowledge in stone because they feared another cataclysm, then later civilizations erased knowledge because they feared disorder, dissent, or confusion. One era sought to preserve continuity, another sought to reshape it. The result is a tapestry with holes, some torn by nature, others by human hands. In this silence, one senses the faint outline of something missing. Not a civilization more advanced than ours, but one more aware of cycles. Cycles of the sky, the earth, and time itself. A worldview that may have survived in fragments of myth, geometry, and ritual, but lost its coherence when the institutions that carried it dissolved. And tonight, as thoughts drift between buried cities and buried memories, another quiet wondering begins to form. If so much of the past was lost through deliberate forgetting, then what truths might still lie hidden, not beneath the ground, but in the spaces where history refuses to speak? What have we been trained not to see? Once the idea of erasure settles into the mind, another layer begins to take shape, one that has lingered on the edges of academic debate for decades, sometimes dismissed, sometimes cautiously acknowledged, but never fully resolved. It is the layer made not of stories or ruins, but of artifacts and geographies that do not fit neatly into the frameworks we use to make sense of the past. They appear like faint silhouettes against a fogged window, unmistakable in outline, yet impossible to see clearly. Scholars file them under anomalies. Fringe researchers claim them as proof of radical theories, and most people forget they exist at all. Yet each carries a quiet weight, a subtle pull, as if urging us to look again at the shape of the world before ours. Consider the Peary race map drawn in 1513, a collage of older charts, some of which the Ottoman admiral claimed were sourced from maps dating to the time of Alexander and beyond. What unsettles researchers is not the existence of ancient charts, but the coastlines depicted. The outline of South America appears more accurate than any European map of the era had reason to be. Even more controversial is the depiction of a southern land mass resembling Antarctica, shown without ice, with coastal contours matching those reconstructed by modern seismic surveys. Mainstream scholars caution against over-interpretation. nodding that cartographers often incorporated mythical lands or imaginative extrapolations. Yet the precision of some elements leaves a lingering suspicion that the map preserves fragments of geographical knowledge older than the classical world, perhaps inherited through many intermediaries from a source now lost. Off the coast of Japan, the Yononi Formation sparks similar debate. Massive terraces, right edges, steps cut with uncanny regularity. Some geologists argue these are natural formations shaped by underwater erosion. Others counter that certain features such as apparent platforms, pillars, and road-like corridors show patterns too deliberate to be accidental. The truth may lie in between, natural stone enhanced by early human hands. Yet if so, the site would date to a time when sea levels were dramatically lower, long before the earliest known Japanese civilizations. Whether natural or human-shaped, the structures stand as a reminder that coastlines we take for granted once held lives and cultures now hidden beneath the waves. Further west, near Malta, divers have found stone formations that appear to echo megalithic motifs found on land. Blocks lie arranged in ways that evoke deliberate placement, though erosion makes certainty elusive. Malta itself hosts some of the oldest freestanding stone temples in the world, predating the pyramids and Stonehenge. The idea that structures of similar design might extend into areas now submerged raises troubling possibilities. Perhaps the archipelago was once part of a larger cultural sphere, now fractured by rising seas. Across the world in Peru, the geoglyphs of the Nazca Desert form shapes so vast they can only be fully viewed from above. Mainstream archaeology interprets them as ritual pathways, offerings to sky deities, or symbols linked to water. These explanations are reasonable. Yet the scale of the lines, drawn with geometric precision across uneven terrain, hints at knowledge of surveying and alignment that goes beyond simple footpaths. The fact that some shapes appear only from specific angles, visible to the horizon rather than directly above, adds to the enigma. They do not break known human capability, but they stretch it, nudging us toward questions about the purpose behind such monumental effort. In Bolivia, the ruins of Pumapunku challenge assumptions in a different way. Stones cut with extraordinary precision, notched and fitted with interlocking joints, carved from materials transported from distant quarries. Some pieces weigh dozens of tons yet were shaped with angles so crisp they resemble modern machining. Mainstream researchers attribute this to skilled stone workers using hammerstones, abrasives, and careful planning. Others propose more unconventional interpretations. Regardless of the explanation, the ruins evoke a sense of lost expertise, a knowledge of engineering and geometry that appears suddenly, shines brightly, and disappears without apparent lineage. Throughout Africa, geoglyphs and stone circles dot landscapes rarely associated with ancient monumental architecture. In the Sahara, circular constructions, some spanning hundreds of meters, quietly occupy remote deserts. In southern Africa, vast clusters of stone enclosures form patterns so large that some researchers speculate they once housed interconnected settlements. Traditional archaeology places most of these sites within the last 2 millennia. Others suspect much deeper origins, pointing to astronomical patterns and ground alignments that suggest older cultural memory. In the Americas, certain petroglyphs appear identical to motifs found in Asia and Europe despite vast oceans separating those populations. The similarity could reflect convergent symbolism, or it could point toward ancient migrations whose traces have not yet been fully mapped. Likewise, certain mound structures in North America bear geometric patterns reminiscent of Neolithic Europe, though mainstream timelines separate the two by thousands of years. A similar problem emerges with the stone spheres of Costa Rica, perfectly round, polished boulders scattered across jungles and riverbeds. Their purpose remains unknown. Their precision rivals modern craftsmanship. Some lie arranged in lines, triangles, or celestial patterns. Others rest where rivers carried them far from their original context. They do not break the limits of human skill, yet their meaning evaporated the moment their makers vanished. Each of these anomalies, taken alone, proves little. Taken together, they create a faint tremor in the narrative, a quiet suggestion that the edges of prehistory may be more complex than we assume. Not because these artifacts indicate lost empires of impossible sophistication, but because they hint at networks, traditions, or migrations that have not fully survived. Perhaps the knowledge of certain forms, certain alignments, certain ways of shaping stone traveled farther than our models allow. Or perhaps these echoes come from cycles deeper than recorded memory, passed down through communities that survived earlier upheavals. Even more haunting is the sense that many anomalies lie not in remote deserts or ocean floors, but in museum storerooms, mislabeled as curiosities or inexplicable artifacts. Archaeologists often note that the majority of discovered objects never appear in exhibits. They remain in crates, cataloged but seldom studied. Within these archives could lie connections yet unnoticed, patterns across regions, similarities in technique, hints of cultural conversations long erased by time. And if anomalies linger in our repositories, what might remain in the landscapes we've not yet explored? The Amazon rainforest only recently yielding signs of massive earthworks through LiDAR scanning. The Arabian Peninsula, whose shifting sands reveal ancient river systems where settlements may once have flourished. The Siberian tundra, hiding frozen sites that melt a little more each year. The world is far from fully mapped, not in the archaeological sense. Much of our past may lie undiscovered simply because no one has looked in the right place. The mind wanders then to a larger question, one too easily forgotten. Why do these anomalies matter? Not because they rewrite history with dramatic flair, but because they remind us that history is less stable than we imagine. It is porous, fragmentary, vulnerable to the tides of nature and the choices of human beings. And on the edges of that vulnerability stand objects that refuse to fit the story, like quiet sentinels guarding the outlines of a world we've not yet recovered. If these scattered fragments belong to a single lost chapter, not a civilization, but a continuity of memory, what shape would that chapter take? And if we could see it clearly, how different would our story of humanity become? As the anomalies gather like loose constellations on the edge of understanding, another thread begins to shimmer beneath them, one not carved into stone or preserved in artifacts, but whispered in the oldest stories of all. Across continents, across languages, across the remnants of civilizations separated by oceans and millennia, there lingers a strange memory that the sky was once different. Not metaphorically, not mythologically, but literally. A subtle shift in the heavens, a change in the rhythm of stars, a moment when the world above transformed in a way so profound that every culture in its own tongue tried to explain it. The idea sounds impossible, even fantastical. Yet the pattern is difficult to ignore. In ancient China, chroniclers wrote of heaven's pillars breaking, the sky tilting, stars shifting paths they once held steady. In Greece, philosophers spoke of ages marked by changes in the celestial order, cycles in which the heavens were not fixed, but turning through epochs. In the Americas, Maya astronomer priests tracked long cycles of time, some exceeding the span of recorded history, suggesting awareness of celestial motions observable only across generations. Aboriginal Australian traditions tell of stars that arrived, vanished, or changed brightness in times beyond memory. And in Egypt, priests of Heliopolis preserved accounts of Yepeks ruled by gods long before human dynasties began. Yepeks whose boundaries were marked by celestial transformations. To modern ears, these stories sound symbolic, allegorical. But astronomy, that quiet discipline watching the sky with a patient older than writing, adds its own quiet weight. For the sky is not fixed. It moves. It changes. It breathes in cycles far longer than human lifetimes. Precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, shifts the positions of stars over millennia. The pole star changes. The constellations drift. To notice this requires continuity, observations carried across many generations. Noticing it early, as some traditions appear to have done, implies something even deeper, a worldview that linked the heavens to the rhythms of the earth. But celestial change is not limited to slow cycles. There are sudden shifts, too. Solar storms that paint the sky in lights visible far from the poles, comets that blaze unexpectedly bright, supernovae that briefly outshine entire constellations. Some such events are recorded in ancient texts. The appearance of the guest star, observed by Chinese astronomers in 1054, now known as the Crab Nebula supernova, a star in Cassiopeia bright enough to cast shadows in the night, comets so brilliant they were seen in daylight. If these occurred in historical times, what might have been witnessed by cultures far older? Cultures whose writings did not survive, or whose stories were later reframed as myth. Tree ring data and ice cores record evidence of extraordinary cosmic events, spikes in radioactive isotopes indicative of solar storms stronger than any measured in modern times. Around 774 CE, one such event left traces across the globe. Another older spike suggests a similar event around 993 CE. And deeper still, in layers older than recorded history, there are hints of cosmic disturbances whose effects lingered in subtle chemical signatures. These events may not have been catastrophic, but they would have lit the sky with unsettling brilliance. Imagine a night suddenly torn open by lights unfurling like curtains, a sky that seemed to ripple, pulsate, or pulse with unfamiliar color. For people living in a world where the heavens were maps, calendars, and omens, such phenomena would not simply be observed, they would be remembered. And then there is the strange question of ancient calendars. Many early civilizations created timekeeping systems far more sophisticated than their material context might suggest. The Maya long count spans thousands of years. The Hindu cosmic time scales stretch into epochs unimaginable in scope. Early Egyptian and Babylonian astronomers tracked cycles that require centuries of continuous observation. Some scholars argue these systems reflect careful empirical study. Others suspect inheritance, the continuation of knowledge developed in earlier times, perhaps by earlier peoples whose records did not survive the upheavals of climate and catastrophe. What deepens the mystery is how often these calendars align with astronomical events of great antiquity. Certain cycles begin not in the era of the culture that recorded them, but in eras long before writing, suggesting that the starting points may reference memories carried orally across many generations. A calendar tied to the heliacal rising of Sirius might have originated in a time when Sirius appeared at a different point in the sky. A cycle marking precession might point toward a world that witnessed the sky's slow turning long before monumental architecture was built. Some myths speak directly of such changes. The Norse remembered a time when the sun's path shifted. The Hopi described previous worlds destroyed by the sky falling. The ancient Vedic text referenced cosmic battles, whose imagery some scholars interpret as metaphorical descriptions of celestial events. The Dune people of Marley hold traditions that include knowledge of Sirius's companion star long before modern telescopes confirmed its existence, though this claim remains debated, complicated by later contact with European explorers. Whether coincidence, distortion, or memory, the presence of such details invites a quiet unease. Why do so many cultures embed precise astronomical references in narratives far older than their scientific traditions? And then there is a stranger whisper still. Across continents, symbols appear that may represent the sky as it once looked. In caves dating back more than 10,000 years, researchers have proposed interpretations of animal figures and abstract markings as star maps. Some rock art may depict constellations aligned with prehistoric skies. These arguments remain contentious, yet the possibility persists that our ancestors carved memories of celestial events into stone: a supernova, a cometary breakup, a meteor storm so intense it turned night to day. Such events could have imprinted themselves upon cultural memory so deeply that they echoed through myth long after the details faded. The sky, after all, was the one vast canvas available to every human culture. When the world beneath their feet changed, when coastlines drowned, when climate shifted, when lands fractured, the stars remained the most stable point of reference. And yet, if the stars themselves changed, what would that mean for those who relied on them? A world where even the heavens were unreliable would have felt like a world unraveling. Perhaps this is why so many ancient cultures framed cosmic change as the end of an age. When the sky changed, something fundamental dissolved. A cycle ended. A new world began. And each new world carried within it the faint memory of the one before. It is here in this fragile space between sky and story that the question grows sharpest. If humanity once witnessed a transformation in the heavens, a shift erased by time and reframed as myth, could that memory be the key connecting the fragments we struggle to understand? The floods, the resets, the alignments, the calendars, the anomalies. They might all be reflections of a single truth seen through different eyes. And if the sky once changed in ways we no longer recognize, what else might it have been trying to tell the people who stood beneath it, watching, afraid, and unable to forget? If the sky once shifted in ways we can no longer fully grasp, then the people who lived through those changes must have tried to preserve what they could. Not in stone alone, not in symbols scattered across continents, but in memory carried through voices, rituals, and stories. And it is here, in the fragile realm of oral tradition, that another path into humanity's forgotten past begins to glow faintly. These memories did not survive through empires or libraries. They survived through human breath, words spoken beside fires, chants whispered across generations, maps recited in rhythms older than writing. They are the memories of the people who remembered when the world was different. Among these traditions, few were as vast or as ancient as the Australian song lines. Anthropologists studying them discovered something unsettling. These stories, some stretching back more than 10,000 years, appear to describe coastlines that existed before sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. Islands that are now submerged, bays that have long since disappeared, cliffs that once stood at the water's edge but now lie far inland. These details are not metaphorical embellishments. They align with modern geological reconstructions. It is as though the land itself were recorded in music long before maps existed, and the memory endured even after the sea reclaimed those shores. Such longevity is rare. Most oral traditions degrade over centuries, but some, under the right conditions, can preserve fragments of deep time with remarkable fidelity. The Andean peoples of South America hold memories of glacial retreats, describing mountains that once wore white mantles and valleys filled with giant lakes that today have long since evaporated. Polynesian navigators remember ancient migration routes stretching across unbroken blue horizons, guided by stars whose positions slowly drifted over generations. Certain North American tribes recount stories of fiery mountains awakening, descriptions that mirror geological events occurring thousands of years ago. And in Africa, some pastoral communities speak of green regions where deserts now stretch unbroken, echoing the climatic shifts that reshaped the Sahara. These accounts do not merely describe the landscape, they describe upheaval, a world altered by forces that reshaped coastlines, seasons, and skis. They recall crossings made possible by land bridges that no longer exist and wanderings forced by droughts that emptied rivers. They speak of a world in transition, a world in which memory itself became the only anchor in a shifting reality. Yet, what makes these traditions truly enigmatic is that they often contain more than environmental detail. They carry knowledge, structured, methodical, intentional. Polynesian navigation chants encode star paths, wave patterns, and island positions with a precision that allowed sailors to cross thousands of miles without instruments. They did not merely memorize directions, they memorized the world. The Dune of Marley preserve cosmological cycles embedded in ritual narratives so old that tracing their origins becomes an exercise in peeling back layers of time. And in the Arctic, the Inuit maintain knowledge of seasonal ice behaviors, patterns so complex and so attuned to subtle changes that modern scientists consult them to understand climate shifts. Such knowledge systems reveal something often overlooked. Oral traditions are not primitive. They are sophisticated mechanisms for encoding information in ways that endure across centuries, sometimes millennia. And if certain traditions survived long enough to recall glacial retreat or rising seas, then one must wonder what else they might preserve. Fragments of migrations we no longer remember, interactions with peoples who no longer exist, memories of skis that no longer look the same. Some of the most haunting examples come from traditions that describe previous worlds. Aboriginal stories speak of earlier epochs when the order of creation was different. The Hopi remember worlds destroyed by fire or flood. The Maria recount the emergence of land from darkness and the reshaping of sky by ancestral beings. These are often interpreted as metaphors, cosmologies designed to explain the structure of the universe. But viewed through another lens, one illuminated by geology and genetics, they might contain translations of ancient upheavals. Perhaps the world before was not a supernatural realm, but an earlier age of humanity erased by climatic catastrophe. Perhaps the gods who shaped the land were ancestral lineages whose memory blurred into myth. Perhaps the falling sky referred not to divine wrath, but to celestial disturbances witnessed in a time no written record survived. Even the structure of these traditions hints at continuity deeper than archaeology can reach. Many indigenous stories contain strict verbal patterns, chants preserved verbatim, prohibitions against alteration. This rigidity might have functioned as a safeguard, ensuring that the memory remained intact across generations. In this way, oral traditions became reservoirs of knowledge that could survive the loss of cities, the collapse of societies, and the movement of peoples. They are, in a sense, living fossils of human thought. There is also the question of symbols. Some oral cultures use carvings, woven patterns, or painted motifs as mnemonic devices, visual anchors that hold stories too complex to memorize through words alone. In the Pacific, stick charts map ocean swells and island chains. In Africa, patterns of beads encode genealogies and migrations. In the Americas, wampum belts stored treaty histories, ceremonial sequences, and clan identities. When paired with oral traditions, these objects function as archives, fragments of knowledge carried in portable form. Many such devices have been misinterpreted or dismissed, their deeper purposes forgot as the cultures that created them were disrupted by colonization or displacement. Which raises a deeper question. What if some of the symbols carved into ancient stones, spirals, grids, lines oriented toward the horizon, were not simply artistic expressions but mnemonic markers? What if they once accompanied stories that have since vanished, leaving only the shapes behind? Without the voices that gave them meaning, these symbols become puzzles. Yet they may represent the remnants of systems of knowledge that once extended across vast distances, connecting people through shared memory rather than shared territory. And then there are the echoes between these traditions. A tale from one continent sometimes resembles a tale from another, not in surface details, but in structure, in theme, in the underlying pattern of thought. Floods, star cycles, lost lands, teachers who came from distant regions, rises and falls of worlds. It is tempting to attribute these similarities to coincidence or universal psychology. Yet oral traditions often carry fingerprints, details specific enough to suggest a common point of reference long before oceans divided populations. The possibility hangs delicately in the air that some traditions may be remembering the same event seen through different eyes. A cosmic disturbance, a climatic upheaval, a migration triggered by forces we no longer understand, a world ending not in myth, but in memory. And if so many of these stories survived across such great distances, carried by people who endured through cycles of change, then one cannot help but wonder what else they might remember. Stories too deeply buried in ritual and symbolism for us to recognize. What if, hidden within the world's oldest voices, there is a message we have not yet learned to hear? The more these voices from the deep past gather, whispers of shifting skis, memories carried through song, symbols carved into stone, the more a strange, quiet pressure begins to form, as though all these fragments are slowly turning toward a single point. Not a conclusion, not an answer, but a question so old it feels woven into the marrow of humanity itself. For if the people who remembered held fragments of an ancient truth, and if the stones held fragments of another, and if the genes carried echoes of a world erased, then something begins to happen when these pieces are contemplated together. A faint outline takes shape, the outline of a story that feels both familiar and entirely unknown. It is the return of the question, who were we before we became who we are now? And why does the past feel as though it's hiding not beneath the ground, but in plain sight, just beyond the edge of collective memory? It becomes impossible not to notice how the fragments seem to speak to one another across boundaries that should separate them. The astronomical alignments described by ancient traditions echo the stone circles arranged to frame solstices. The stories of previous worlds mirror the geological layers shaped by climatic upheaval. The isolated languages whisper of migrations we can no longer trace. And the myths describing teachers or sky beings feel like poetic memories of encounters now lost to the archaeological record. None of these elements alone would mean much, but when placed side by side, their resonances grow louder, like the scattered tones of an instrument slowly reorganizing into a single melody. In many indigenous cosmologies, the present world is not the first, but the latest in a long succession. Human identity in this view is cyclical, renewed after each collapse, reshaped each time the world awakens again. Archaeology, in its own language, hints at something similar: periods of abrupt cultural disappearance followed by sudden reorganization, settlements abandoned in silence only to be resettled centuries later, traditions rising fully formed after long intervals of dormancy. It is as though humanity has lived through several beginnings, each separated by an interval of forgetting. Whether through catastrophe or gradual drift, something always intervenes, a darkness between ages where memory thins, cultures crumble, and the thread connecting one world to the next begins to fray. In this fragile interval, the question returns again: did humanity start over once or many times? And if many times, why does the archaeological record feel like a mosaic with entire sections missing, as though someone tried to stitch together a tapestry but found too many threads cut short? One cannot help thinking of the parallels between the earliest monumental structures. In Gobek, the builders carved animals that do not all appear local. Some images resemble species associated with distant regions or earlier climatic phases. In Malta, spirals and double spirals appear on ancient temples with similarities to motifs in Ireland, Brittany, and even Mesoamerica, though no direct contact between these cultures is known. In southeast Turkey, the earlier settlements display symbolic patterns that look strangely similar to designs found thousands of years later in the Indus Valley. These similarities could be coincidence, or they could be the faint lingering memory of a worldview shared before the world was divided by rising seas and shifting climates. Even linguistic isolates sometimes echo each other in subtle ways, not in vocabulary, but in structure, in rhythm, in grammar that seems to carry an older logic. Some linguists note that certain isolates share features that make no sense when contrasted with their geographical neighbors. These features could represent the remnants of linguistic families older than any we can reconstruct, branches severed by population bottlenecks or by migrations too ancient to leave clear archaeological traces. It is as though pieces of a very old language survive in distant corners of the world, like scattered fragments of a broken vessel. If these fragments reflect a deeper continuity, then what broke that continuity? Catastrophe remains one possibility, climate upheaval another. But the more one studies the record, the more another pattern emerges, one woven not by nature, but by humanity itself. Erasure, suppression, the quiet rewriting of memory. History, as it has come down to us, is shaped as much by what was excluded as by what was preserved. Empires destroyed the sacred texts of rivals. Religions absorbed or replaced the myths that preceded them. Scholars dismissed traditions that did not fit prevailing frameworks. And over time, each act of forgetting formed another layer of sediment over the already buried past. Perhaps this is why so many traditions speak of ancestors who knew the old ways, walked with the stars, or understood the cycles. These traditions often describe a time before writing, before agriculture, before cities. Yet they imbue the people of that time with a kind of awareness that seems disproportionate to their material remains. It may not have been technological advancement, as modern imagination often assumes. It may have been something quieter, something more attuned to the rhythms of the earth and sky, knowledge that was experiential, embodied, passed through ritual and observation rather than carved into scrolls or stone. But then something changed. Whether through catastrophe or choice, the continuity fractured. Knowledge that once pulsed through communities dispersed, faded, or became hidden behind layers of symbolism. And in its place grew new ways of seeing, linear histories instead of cyclical cosmologies, material explanations instead of mythic ones, categories that separated science from story, astronomy from ritual, geology from memory. These new frameworks are powerful. They illuminate much, but they also obscure ways of thinking that allowed earlier people to perceive patterns across vast stretches of time as the modern world examines these fragments. Stones aligned to forgotten skis, oral traditions describing drowned coastlines, languages with no relatives, maps hinting at vanished lands. A subtle tension emerges. We sense that something is missing, yet we cannot name it. We sense that humanity was once connected by a thread that no longer exists, a thread now reduced to isolated clues. The deeper we look, the more these clues appear less like random anomalies and more like faint reflections of an older unity. A unity obscured by time, by catastrophe, or by deliberate forgetting. And through all these reflections, a quiet unease grows. It is not the fear of some lost civilization, whose ruins remain hidden beneath ocean floors. It is not the threat of vanished technologies more advanced than our own. It is something smaller, stranger, more intimate. The fear that the story we tell ourselves about being the first, the apex, the beginning, may not be the whole story. That beneath our confidence lies a subtle, unacknowledged vulnerability. Perhaps we are part of a cycle we have not yet recognized. And if all these fragments, myths, stones, languages, stars, memories, are pointing toward a forgotten turning of that cycle, then a deeper question rises quietly, like a shadow between breaths. What part of ourselves have we forgotten? And what might return when we finally remember? As the fragments drift together, stones remembering the sky, languages remembering migrations, myths remembering worlds before this one, genes remembering lineages erased, the outline of something larger begins to settle over the mind like a thin veil. Not a revelation, but a sensation. A feeling that humanity is older than its stories, and that the stories themselves are only the faintest traces of something that once stretched across horizons we no longer recognize. By now, the question is not whether pieces are missing. It is how much we can still recover from the few that remain. And beneath that lies an even quieter wondering. If all these echoes belong to a single forgotten thread, then what kind of world might have existed before the one we call history? It is easy to imagine the past as a straight line, a rise from simplicity to complexity. But everything we have followed suggests that human experience moves instead like a tide. It advances, recedes, and returns in rhythms older than empires. Knowledge does not accumulate evenly. It flares and diminishes, rises in one region while vanishing in another. Sometimes it condenses into stone or symbols or chants. Sometimes it disperses into silence. And somewhere within that ebb and flow, humanity itself reshapes, not physically perhaps, but in ways of seeing, ways of organizing memory, ways of understanding place and time. This is the thread that winds through every fragment we have touched. The sudden emergence of art long before cities. The abrupt appearance of monumental architecture where only small settlements had existed. The isolated languages that hint at ghost population and deeper migrations. The myths that insist the world has ended before. The oral traditions that recall coastlines no longer present. The alignments that track cycles too long for any single culture to observe. The anomalies that resist classification. The erasers that reset the story each time began to settle into shape. One begins to sense a kind of inheritance, not of tools or techniques, but of a worldview, something fragile carried forward unconsciously. The quiet belief that the earth moves in cycles, that the sky carries messages, that memory can survive through ritual and geometry long after names and dates have dissolved. Even our instinct to build, to measure, to align ourselves with the heavens feels older than any civilization. It is as though early humanity did not invent these impulses, but rediscovered them. If there was once a deeper understanding, one not technological but experiential, perhaps it did not vanish entirely. Perhaps it was carried into new worlds in fragments, encoded in myths, in the rhythms of ceremonies, in the alignment of temples, in the structure of languages, in the stories whispered by elders beside firelight. And when the old world fell beneath water or ash, or simply drifted into forgetting, these fragments floated to the surface of the next world, attaching themselves to new cultures like seeds carried by wind. The continuity was not perfect, but it was enough. Enough for people who had never met to orient stone toward the same stars. Enough for symbols to recur across continents. Enough for stories of floods, teachers, and forgotten ages to echo in places separated by millennia of wandering. Enough for humans to sense pattern long after the reason for those patterns faded. What we call anomalies might be the remnants of this inheritance, distorted by time, yet persistent enough to survive. But the greatest mystery is not what our ancestors knew. It is what they feared we might forget. So many ancient structures seem to carry a sense of urgency, a desire to mark something important, to point toward something larger, to anchor memory in stone before the next tide washed over it. Not warnings in the modern sense, but reminders, coordinates, patterns, cycles. Perhaps they understood that humanity drifts, that memory thins, that worlds begun in clarity often end in confusion. And so they carved what they could into places that might outlast them. In this light, even the simplest artifacts, the stone circles, the spirals, the ceremonial pathways, seem less like relics of superstition and more like gestures toward continuity. Attempts to bridge one age to the next, attempts to say, we were here before and we learned something worth remembering. But the world changed faster than memory could adapt, and eventually the fragments scattered beyond recognition. Yet they did not vanish completely. They linger in the places where human consciousness still quiets itself. In the rhythm of chants, in the pattern of woven cloth, in the geometry of temples, in the stories elders guard, even when no one else believes them. They linger in the instinct to look up at the night sky and feel that it is telling a story older than stars. They linger in the questions we cannot stop asking. And so the final question begins to take shape, not as an answer to everything we have uncovered, but as a thread connecting all the uncertainties. Throughout history, humanity has carried a strange, pervasive sense that something important lies just beyond reach. A memory we can almost touch but never fully grasp. A feeling of standing at the edge of something ancient, something intimate, something we once knew. Perhaps this feeling is not illusion. Perhaps it is the echo of the world before ours. A world we inherited but did not create. a world that survived only in traces left behind by those who lived through its end. They may not have had machines or technologies beyond our comprehension. They may not have been the mythical civilizations imagined by speculative tales. But they were watchers of the sky, listeners to the earth, keepers of cycles, recorders of time measured in ages rather than centuries. And maybe, in some sense, they left us not instructions but reminders, fragments scattered widely so that at least a few might endure the next forgetting. Now standing at the end of this slow journey through memory and silence, one last image rises, a handprint on a cave wall, a mark made tens of thousands of years ago by someone who could not know which worlds would follow. Yet the gesture is unmistakable, a presence reaching toward the future, a message without words, a promise that the past is never entirely lost. And so, as the veil settles lightly back into place, a question drifts softly through the quiet. If this ancient inheritance still lives in the margins of our stories, our stones, our languages, our myths, then who truly might we become when we finally learn how to listen to it?